25 years. That's how long the truth slept beneath layers of legal technicalities and scientific limitations. In 1985, a military family was destroyed in their Fayetteville home, a mother and two daughters killed, a baby left alone for 3 days. The case seemed solved, then unsolved, then forgotten. But DNA doesn't forget, and when technology finally caught up to evil, the man who walked free discovered that justice, like evidence, can be preserved indefinitely. Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The late spring air carried the scent of Carolina pines through the windows of 367 Summerhill Road. Catherine Eastburn moved through her kitchen with practiced efficiency, preparing dinner while keeping one eye on her 3 daughters. 5-year-old Kara chattered about her day at kindergarten, 3-year-old Erin played with wooden blocks on the living room carpet, and 22-month-old Jana toddled between rooms, her small hands reaching for everything within grasp. The Eastburn home embodied military precision wrapped in domestic warmth. Catherine had married into the Air Force life, accepting its rhythms of deployment and reunion, order and uncertainty. Tonight, Captain Gary Eastburn was 800 miles away at Maxwell Air Force Base, attending training that would advance his career. She managed alone, as military spouses learn to do. The classified section of the Fayetteville Observer lay open beside her coffee cup. She had written the advertisement herself that morning. Free to good home, English setter, well-trained, good with children. Dixie, their gentle dog, would not be making the family's upcoming overseas assignment. Military regulations were clear: pets, complicated international moves. Better to find Dixie a loving family than abandon her to uncertainty. The phone rang at 7:30. Catherine answered, balancing Jana on her hip. "Ma'am, I'm calling about the dog in today's paper," the voice said. Professional, polite, military bearing evident even through the telephone. "I'm stationed at Fort Bragg, Sergeant Timothy Hennis." Catherine smiled. A soldier would understand responsibility. "She's a wonderful dog, very gentle with our girls. Could I come see her tomorrow?" "I've been wanting a family dog for some time." They arranged the meeting for afternoon. Catherine noted his courteous manner, his patience with her questions about his living situation and experience with pets. Military families looked out for each other. Trust was the currency of their community. That evening, she tucked each daughter into bed with the same routine stories for Kara, songs for Erin, gentle rocking for Jana. The house settled into its familiar nighttime quiet. Outside, Summerhill Road dozed under streetlights, another peaceful evening in a town built around service and tradition. The next afternoon, a white Chevrolet Chevette pulled into the Eastburn driveway. Timothy Hennis stepped out, average height, brown hair, wearing civilian clothes but carrying himself with military bearing. He appeared exactly as Catherine had imagined, responsible, earnest, someone who would care for Dixie properly. The meeting unfolded smoothly. Dixie responded well to Hennis, accepting his offered hand and wagging her tail. Kara peppered him with questions about where Dixie would live, whether she would have a yard, if she would remember them. Hennis answered patiently, his demeanor calm and reassuring. "She'll have a good home," he promised, kneeling to Kara's eye level. "I'll take good care of her." Catherine watched the interaction approvingly. Military children learned early to assess character. Their safety often depended on reading people correctly. Kara seemed comfortable with this stranger who would become Dixie's new family. The paperwork took minutes. No money changed hands. Catherine wanted only Dixie's welfare assured. Hennis loaded the dog into his car, thanked Catherine genuinely, and drove away. The transaction felt complete, satisfying. She had found Dixie a good home. Neighbors noticed the white Chevette, as neighbors do. Mrs. Morrison across the street saw the man with the dog, the friendly exchange, the comfortable resolution of a simple advertisement. Summerhill Road operated on such small kindnesses, military families, helping military families, trust given and received without suspicion. That evening, Hennis told co-workers at Fort Bragg about his afternoon. "Met a nice lady with kids," he mentioned casually. "Got myself a good dog. No one paid particular attention." Soldiers adopted pets regularly, especially those preparing for family life. Catherine spent the evening reassuring her daughters that Dixie would be happy in her new home. The house felt different without the dog's presence, but she had made the right decision. The overseas assignment would be complicated enough without worrying about pet transportation and quarantine requirements. Gary called from Maxwell that night, their usual check-in conversation. Catherine mentioned finding Dixie a home, described the polite sergeant who had adopted her. Life continued its predictable course. Gary would return Friday, they would finalize overseas preparations, the family would move forward together. None of them could imagine that Dixie's adoption had opened a door that should have remained closed forever. May 9th dawned, warm and humid, typical spring weather for eastern North Carolina. Mrs. Morrison noticed the Eastburn newspapers still lying in the driveway when she retrieved her own afternoon delivery. Strange, Catherine always collected them promptly. The house looked undisturbed, curtains drawn, no movement visible through windows. By evening, concern shifted to worry. The papers had accumulated for 2 days now, an unusual sight on meticulously maintained Summerhill Road. Neighbors began exchanging glances, hushed conversations. Military, families operated on schedules, disrupted routines, suggested problems. The smell reached Mrs. Morrison's kitchen window around dinner time. Faint but unmistakable, something wrong carried on the evening breeze. She called the police without hesitation. In military communities, unusual behavior demanded investigation. Officers arrived at 367 Summerhill Road at 8:15. The newspapers lay scattered where they had fallen May 7th, 8th, 9th. The front door was unlocked. Officer Davis called out as he entered, following department protocol for welfare checks. The silence felt oppressive, unnatural. No sounds of family life, no television or radio, no voices responding to his announcement. He moved through the living room, noting toys scattered across the carpet, a coffee cup on the kitchen counter. Ordinary life interrupted. The hallway stretched toward the bedrooms. Officer Davis called again, receiving only silence. He approached the first door, pushed it open, and discovered what 25 years would never erase from his memory. Catherine Eastburn lay on her bed, brutally beaten and stabbed multiple times. The savagery of the attack was immediately apparent. This was no burglary gone wrong, no crime of opportunity. Someone had entered this home with violence in mind. Officer Davis radioed for backup, then continued searching. Kara's room held another horror. The 5-year-old had been killed in her own bed. Aaron, 3 years old, had suffered the same fate. The house had become a tomb, but from the nursery came an unexpected sound, crying. Jana, 22 months old, stood in her crib, dehydrated and weak but alive. She had survived 3 days alone, surrounded by death, waiting for help that finally arrived. Within minutes, Summerhill Road filled with emergency vehicles. Detectives secured the scene while paramedics rushed Jana to Cape Fear Valley Hospital. Word spread through Fayetteville like wildfire. A military family had been slaughtered, an innocent baby found alone among the bodies. The investigation began immediately. Crime scene technicians documented everything: the forced entry, the signs of struggle, the brutal efficiency of the attacks. This was personal, intimate violence, someone familiar with the house layout, someone who knew when Gary would be away. Detective Thompson walked through each room methodically, building a timeline. The attack had occurred at night, probably May 6th or early morning May 7th. The killer had spent time in the house, suggesting comfort with the location. This was not random violence. Someone had targeted the Eastburn family specifically. By midnight, Fayetteville understood that its sense of security had been shattered. Military families who never locked their doors began checking windows and installing deadbolts. Trust, the foundation of their community, had died with Catherine, Kara, and Aaron Eastburn. The monster who had done this was still out there, somewhere in their midst. Detective Thompson began the investigation where all good detectives begin, with the last known contacts. Catherine's calendar showed routine appointments, doctor visits, school conferences, grocery shopping. Nothing suggested danger or conflict. Her friends described a devoted mother, a loving wife, someone without enemies. The dog adoption stood out as the only unusual recent contact. Catherine had mentioned placing the classified ad to several neighbors. Mrs. Morrison remembered seeing the white Chevette, the polite man who had taken Dixie, a lead worth pursuing. The Fayetteville Observer provided the original advertisement and phone records. The inquiries had been few, only 3 people had called about Dixie. 2 had been eliminated quickly: a local family who had decided against adoption, and an elderly woman who lived too far away. The third caller identified himself as Sergeant Timothy Hennis from Fort Bragg. Military personnel records made Hennis easy to locate. 28 years old, married, stationed at Fort Bragg for 18 months. Clean service record, no disciplinary actions, described by supervisors as competent and reliable. On the surface, exactly the type of person military families trusted with their pets and their safety. Detective Thompson arrived at Fort Bragg on May 10th. The interview began routinely. Hennis confirmed adopting Dixie on May 7th, described the pleasant interaction with Catherine, expressed shock at news of the murders. His story matched neighbors' observations: brief visit, Friendly exchange, no apparent problems. But inconsistencies emerged under questioning. Hennis claimed he had gone straight home after collecting Dixie, spent the evening with his wife, yet witnesses had seen his white Chevette near Summerhill Road that night, hours after the adoption. When confronted, his explanations became vague, defensive. "I might have driven by again," he admitted finally, "wanted to make sure I could find the house, if Dixie needed veterinary care. But I never stopped, never got out." The story felt rehearsed, artificial. Detective Thompson pressed harder. Why return at night? Why not ask for the veterinarian's information during the adoption? Hennis grew agitated, his military composure cracking under scrutiny. The forensic evidence began supporting suspicion. Hair fibers found at the crime scene were consistent with Hennis's appearance. Blood type analysis narrowed the suspect pool, type O, matching Hennis and roughly 40% of the population. Circumstantial evidence, but building toward a pattern. Most damning was witness testimony. 3 separate neighbors had seen a white Chevette cruising Summerhill Road on the night of May 6, driving slowly past the Eastburn house. One witness, walking his dog near midnight, remembered seeing a man carrying what appeared to be a canvas bag, walking quickly away from the area where Hennis's car was parked. Fingerprint analysis frustrated. Investigators, the killer had apparently worn gloves or carefully avoided leaving clear prints. But fiber evidence told a different story. Threads found on Catherine's clothing matched Hennis's work shirts. Cotton fibers from his khaki pants were recovered from the living room carpet. The circumstantial web tightened daily. Hennis had opportunity. He knew Catherine was alone with the children. He had access. The dog adoption provided legitimate reason to visit the house. His return that night suggested premeditation, not impulse. On May 15, Detective Thompson presented the evidence to Assistant District Attorney William Van Osteen. The prosecutor reviewed everything carefully. Witness statements, forensic analysis, timeline reconstruction. The case was strong enough for arrest, though he acknowledged its circumstantial nature. "We have motive, opportunity, and physical evidence linking him to the scene," Van Osteen concluded. "Not perfect, but sufficient for prosecution." The N7 arrest occurred at Fort Bragg on May 16, 1985. Detective Thompson approached Hennis during his lunch break, away from his unit to minimize disruption. Military protocol required coordination with base command, but civilian authorities maintained jurisdiction over off-base crimes. "Sergeant Hennis, you're under arrest for the murders of Catherine, Kara, and Aaron Eastburn," Thompson announced, producing handcuffs. Fellow soldiers watched in stunned silence as one of their own was led away. The news explosion was immediate and devastating. Fayetteville had trusted its military community implicitly. Soldiers were protectors, not predators. Headlines screamed the impossible. Army sergeant charged in family slayings. The town's foundation cracked along fault lines of disbelief and betrayal. At the Cumberland County Jail, Hennis maintained his innocence while his world collapsed. The Army suspended him from duty pending resolution of civilian charges. His wife, devastated by accusations against her husband, struggled with community ostracism and media attention. Their own safety became questionable as public anger grew. Pretrial preparation revealed the case's complexity. Assistant District Attorney Van Osteen assembled evidence methodically, building timelines and witness lists. The prosecution strategy would emphasize the personal nature of the crime. Hennis had entered the Eastburn home through the dog adoption, gained Catherine's trust, then returned under cover of darkness to commit unspeakable violence. Defense attorney Billy Richardson faced an enormous challenge. His client was a soldier accused of murdering a military family, including 2 small children. Public sentiment ran heavily against Hennis. Richardson's only hope lay in exposing weaknesses in the circumstantial evidence, creating reasonable doubt about guilt. The forensic evidence, while suggestive, was not conclusive. Hair and fiber analysis could indicate similarity but not certainty. Blood type matching placed Hennis among suspects, but did not eliminate other possibilities. Without fingerprints, DNA analysis, or direct witnesses to the crime itself, the case relied on inference and interpretation. Richardson focused on alternative explanations. Several men had been seen in the Summerhill Road area during the relevant time frame. The crime showed signs of personal rage. What motive did Hennis have for such violence? He had obtained the dog peacefully, interacted normally with the family. Why would he return to commit murder? Judge Lacey H. Thornburg would preside over the trial, scheduled for early 1986. His courtroom had handled serious criminal cases before, but never one with such emotional intensity. The community demanded justice for the Eastburn family. The defendant deserved presumption of innocence until proven guilty. Balancing these competing demands would test every aspect of the judicial system. Gary Eastburn flew home from Maxwell Air Force Base to bury his family and face an incomprehensible future. The man who had calmly accepted Dixie from Catherine's hands was now accused of destroying everything Gary held sacred. The irony felt poisonous. Their trust, their kindness, their willingness to help a fellow soldier had apparently created the opportunity for this horror. Standing beside 3 graves at Lafayette Memorial Park, Gary Eastburn looked across the gathering of friends, family, and fellow military personnel. Somewhere among the hundreds of mourners might be people who knew more about that night than they had revealed. The investigation would continue, but the damage was permanent. Catherine, Kara, and Aaron were gone forever, and no verdict could restore what had been stolen. Jana, recovering in the hospital, represented both miracle and tragedy saved by chance timing, but destined to grow up without the family that had protected her through her first precious months of life. Gary would raise her, alone, carrying memories too painful to share and questions that might never find answers. The trial of Timothy Hennis would begin soon. Justice, delayed by legal process, waited in Judge Thornburg's courtroom. The trial began on January 7, 1986, amid unprecedented media attention. Judge Lacey H. Thornburg's courtroom overflowed with reporters, spectators, and military personnel. Fayetteville had never experienced such intense public scrutiny of its judicial system. The pressure for swift, decisive justice was palpable. Assistant District Attorney Van Osteen opened with graphic descriptions of the crime scene. Photographs of Catherine, Kara, and Aaron in death shocked the jury and gallery. The brutality was undeniable. Someone had entered the Eastburn home with murder in mind, executing a defenseless family with calculated violence. The evidence will show that Timothy Hennis gained entry to the Eastburn home through deception, Van Osteen argued. He used the dog adoption to study the family's routines, to learn when Captain Eastburn would be away. Then he returned under cover of darkness to assault Catherine Eastburn and kill anyone who might identify him. The prosecution's case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence and emotional impact. Witness testimony placed Hennis's distinctive white Chevette near the crime scene. Fiber analysis suggested his presence inside the house. His changing story about returning that night indicated consciousness of guilt. Catherine's mother testified through tears, describing her daughter's last phone call, her excitement about the overseas assignment, her love for her children. The emotional testimony devastated the courtroom. Several jurors wept openly as family photographs were displayed. Christmas mornings, birthday parties, ordinary moments that would never happen again. Defense attorney Richardson faced an uphill battle against such overwhelming emotion. His strategy focused on reasonable doubt. The evidence was circumstantial. The investigation rushed by public pressure to solve a horrific crime quickly. Timothy Hennis adopted a dog, Richardson told the jury. That's what the evidence proves conclusively. Everything else is speculation, assumption, and rushed judgment by investigators desperate to give this community someone to blame. Richardson highlighted inconsistencies in witness testimony. The neighbor who claimed to see someone carrying a bag admitted poor lighting and distance, made identification uncertain. Fiber evidence could have innocent explanations. Hennis had been inside the house legally during the dog adoption, but the prosecution's emotional case proved overwhelming. Gary Eastburn testified about receiving notification of his family's death, about returning home to find his world destroyed. His quiet dignity and obvious grief moved the courtroom profoundly. I trusted him, Gary said, looking directly at Hennis. We all trusted him. He was a fellow soldier. Catherine invited him into our home because we believed in the honor of the uniform he wore. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. First-degree murder for Catherine, Kara, and Aaron Eastburn. Judge Thornburg sentenced Hennis to death, expressing hope that justice had been served for the victims and their family. Fayetteville exhaled collectively. The monster was captured, tried, and condemned. Children could sleep safely again. Military families could trust their neighbors. The system had worked, however painfully. But in 1988, the North Carolina Supreme Court shattered that sense of closure. The appellate decision was stunning in its scope and implications. By a 4-3 margin, the state's highest court overturned Hennis's conviction, citing prejudicial error in the admission of graphic crime scene photographs. The images, while accurate, were so inflammatory that they prevented a fair trial. The probative value of the marriage photographs was substantially outweighed by their prejudicial impact. the majority opinion stated. The jury's verdict appears based more on emotional reaction than objective evaluation of evidence. Defense attorney Richardson had argued successfully that the prosecution used the photographs to inflame rather than inform. The pictures showed the crime's brutality but added little to establishing Hennis's guilt. Their primary purpose was emotional manipulation of the jury. The decision ordered a new trial with restrictions on photographic evidence. Assistant District Attorney Van Osteen was devastated but determined. The evidence remained strong: fiber analysis, witness testimony, Hennis's suspicious behavior. A second jury would convict based on facts rather than emotion. Fayetteville reacted with shock and anger. Families who had found peace in the verdict now faced reopened wounds. Gary Eastburn, attempting to rebuild his life with Jana, received the news like another death in the family. Justice delayed felt like justice denied. The retrial was moved to Wilmington to ensure an impartial jury pool. By 1989, media coverage had saturated Cumberland County, making fair selection impossible locally. Judge James M. Webb presided over the new proceedings, determined to prevent the emotional excesses that had doomed the first trial. Richardson, emboldened by the successful appeal, mounted a more aggressive defense. He challenged the fiber evidence more thoroughly, bringing in experts who questioned the analysis methods. He emphasized the lack of direct evidence: no fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses to the actual crime. 4 years have passed since these tragic murders, Richardson argued. The pressure to solve this case led investigators to focus prematurely on Timothy Hennis. They found a suspect and built a case around him, rather than following evidence wherever it led. The prosecution struggled without the graphic photographs that had been example, proven so effective previously. Van Osteen presented the same circumstantial evidence, but its impact felt diminished in the sterile atmosphere of the Wilmington courtroom. The case seemed weaker, more speculative. New testimony emerged that had been overlooked initially. Several men matching Hennis's general description had been seen in the Summerhill Road area during the relevant time frame. Military personnel moved frequently through Fayetteville. Any of them could have answered Catherine's advertisement, studied the family's routines, planned the attack. The defense raised questions about the investigation's thoroughness. Had police explored all leads, or had they focused exclusively on Hennis after identifying him as a suspect? The pressure for quick resolution might have prevented complete examination of alternatives. After 8 days of testimony and 36 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict: not guilty on all counts. Timothy Hennis was free. The courtroom erupted. Hennis wept with relief while his supporters cheered. Gary Eastburn sat in stunned silence, watching his family's killer walk away unpunished. 4 years of legal proceedings had ended in complete vindication for the accused. Within weeks, the Army reinstated Hennis with full back pay and promoted him to staff sergeant. His service record remained unblemished. The civilian courts had failed to prove guilt, so military justice recognized his innocence. He served honorably until retirement, his name cleared officially, if not socially. The case went cold, filed away with thousands of other unsolved crimes. Years passed with grinding inevitability. Gary Eastburn moved frequently, seeking geographic distance from memories that followed everywhere. Jana grew up knowing her mother and sisters only through photographs and stories. Carrying survivor's guilt, she was too young to understand but old enough to feel. Detective Thompson, promoted but never satisfied, kept the Eastburn evidence stored carefully in climate-controlled conditions. Crime scene samples from 1985 remain viable, awaiting technologies that did not yet exist. Science would catch up to evil. Eventually, Thompson believed this with religious conviction. Hennis completed his military career without incident, retiring with full honors in the late 1990s. He moved to Oklahoma, started a small business, lived quietly among people who had never heard of the Eastburn murders. The past seemed buried permanently under years of ordinary life. But in 2003, the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office received a grant for cold case investigation. Advanced DNA analysis had become routine, accessible, reliable. Evidence that had been inconclusive in 1985 could now provide definitive answers. The Eastburn case topped the priority list. Catherine's autopsy had preserved biological evidence from her sexual assault evidence that had been tested for blood type but never subjected to genetic analysis. Technology now existed to extract complete DNA profiles from degraded samples. The North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation accepted the evidence for reanalysis. Forensic scientists worked carefully with samples nearly 20 years old, using polymerase chain reaction techniques to amplify genetic material. The process took months, but results justified the patience. A complete male DNA profile emerged from the preserved evidence. The genetic fingerprint was clear, unambiguous, suitable for database comparison. In 2005, the profile was uploaded to CODIS, the combined DNA index system that maintained genetic records for convicted offenders and unsolved crimes. The hit came back immediately. Timothy Hennis, Detective Mike Locklear, Thompson's successor, received the notification on a routine Monday morning. He read the report 3 times before believing it. The man acquitted in 1989, the soldier who had before retired with honors, the businessman living peacefully in Oklahoma. His DNA had been inside Catherine Eastburn the night she died. The evidence was irrefutable. DNA analysis matched Hennis to the sexual assault with probability exceeding 1 in 13 trillion. No possibility of error, contamination, or misidentification existed. Science had spoken with absolute certainty, but legal obstacles remained formidable. Double jeopardy prevented prosecution in civilian court. Hennis had been acquitted, and the Constitution prohibited trying him again for the same crime. The DNA evidence, however conclusive, could not overcome this fundamental protection. District Attorney Billy West consulted legal experts, searching for options. The discovery came through military law research. Although retired, Hennis could be recalled to active duty under certain circumstances. Military justice operated under different constitutional principles than civilian courts. Double jeopardy did not apply between WTS, separate sovereign jurisdictions. The strategy was unprecedented but legally sound. If the Army recalled Hennis to active duty, he could face court-martial for crimes committed while previously serving. Military prosecutors would have jurisdiction over offenses that occurred on or near military installations, involving military families. In 2006, the Department of Defense issued recall orders for retired Staff Sergeant Timothy Hennis. 21 years after the murders, 15 years after his acquittal, justice was stirring again. The Army's decision to recall Hennis created constitutional and procedural questions that reached the highest levels of military and civilian justice. Legal scholars debated the precedent being set: could retired personnel be recalled decades later to face courts-martial for crimes already adjudicated in civilian courts? Military prosecutors argued that the Eastburn murders fell under military jurisdiction because they involved a service member's family living near a military installation. The Uniform Code of Military Justice provided broad authority over crimes affecting military communities, regardless of where they technically occurred. Hennis hired civilian attorney Frank Spinner, who challenged the recall order through federal court. The case raised fundamental questions about sovereignty, double jeopardy, and the limits of military authority over retired personnel. This is unprecedented prosecution, Spinner argued. Timothy Hennis was tried twice in civilian court, acquitted once, and lived as a free man for 16 years. The military cannot resurrect a case that civilian justice has resolved. But federal judges upheld the recall authority. Military and civilian jurisdictions were separate sovereigns under constitutional law. Hennis's retirement did not eliminate the Army's authority over crimes committed while he was on active duty. The court-martial could proceed. Preparation took 4 years as prosecutors assembled evidence and witnesses from a case now 25 years old. Original investigators had retired or died. Physical evidence required careful authentication. Witnesses struggled to remember details from events that had occurred decades earlier. The DNA evidence remained unshakable. Dr. Dixie Peters, from the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, had overseen the analysis personally. Chain of custody documentation stretched back to 1985, showing continuous proper storage and handling. The genetic profile was complete, uncontaminated, and definitively linked to Hennis. Science has given us certainty that the investigation never had, Peters explained to prosecutors. In 1985, we could determine blood type and basic characteristics. Now we can identify individuals with mathematical precision, approaching absolute certainty. The prosecution team, led by military lawyers specializing in capital cases, faced the challenge of presenting 25-year-old evidence to a modern jury. Crime scene photographs, witness testimony, and forensic analysis would need updating and clarification for contemporary standards. Defense attorney Spinner prepared to argue that DNA evidence, while accurate, did not prove murder. His strategy would acknowledge Hennis's sexual contact with Catherine Eastburn while claiming it was consensual, a desperate argument unsupported by any other evidence, but the only legal path available. DNA proves sexual contact occurred, Spinner would argue. It does not prove rape, and it certainly does not prove murder. The prosecution must still establish intent, premeditation, and causation. Gary Eastburn, now in his 50s, watched these legal maneuvers with mixture of hope and exhaustion. Jana, grown to adulthood with no memory of the family she had lost, struggled with decisions about testimony and publicity. The case had defined their lives for 25 years. Would it finally provide the all-way justice that had been so long delayed? Fort Bragg prepared for the most significant court-martial in its modern history. Military justice would have its opportunity to succeed where civilian courts had failed. The truth about May 6, 1985, would finally emerge under oath. The court-martial convened at Fort Bragg on March 29, 2010, exactly 25 years and 23 days after the Eastburn murders. Colonel Patrick Parrish presided over a military jury of 7 officers, each vetted for impartiality, despite the case's notoriety throughout the military community. The courtroom's atmosphere differed markedly from the emotional circus of the civilian trials. Military justice emphasized discipline, procedure, and factual determination over theatrical advocacy. The gallery filled with reporters, legal observers, and military personnel, but disruptions would not be tolerated. Captain John Riesenberg delivered the prosecution's opening statement with military precision. Unlike civilian prosecutors who had relied on circumstantial evidence and emotional appeals, Riesenberg possessed scientific certainty. 25 years ago, Sergeant Timothy Hennis murdered 3 innocent people and sexually assaulted a 4th, Riesenberg stated. Science has now proven his guilt beyond any mathematical doubt. DNA evidence places him at the scene, inside the victim, on the night of the crime. Everything else is commentary. Defense attorney Spinner faced an impossible task. DNA evidence linking his client to the sexual assault was irrefutable. His only option was arguing that sexual contact was consensual, a claim unsupported by any evidence and contradicted by the violence of the crime. DNA proves sexual contact occurred, Spinner acknowledged. But sexual contact does not equal rape, and rape does not equal murder. The prosecution must prove intent, premeditation, and causation beyond reasonable doubt. Dr. Dixie Peters testified first, explaining DNA analysis to the military jury with scientific precision. The genetic profile extracted from Catherine Eastburn's autopsy matched Timothy Hennis with probability exceeding 1 in 13 trillion. To put this in perspective, Peters explained, the odds of error are less than finding one specific grain of sand on all the beaches of North Carolina. The match is scientifically certain. Cross-examination could not shake Peters's testimony. Chain of custody was impeccable. Analysis methods were validated and accepted by scientific consensus. The DNA evidence stood unassailable. Crime scene investigators from 1985 testified about physical evidence that had seemed inconclusive at the time, but now supported the DNA findings. Fibers, hair samples, and blood evidence created a coherent narrative when combined with genetic proof. Gary Eastburn took the witness stand for the 3rd time in 25 years. Now graying and bearing the weight of decades, he testified with quiet dignity about losing his family and spending a quarter-century waiting for justice. I trusted him, Gary said, looking at Hennis. We all did. He wore our uniform, shared our values, or so we thought. My wife welcomed him into our home because she believed in the honor that uniform represented. Jana Eastburn, now 26, testified about growing up with survivor's guilt, about knowing her family only through photographs, about the impact of living with unanswered questions for 25 years. I survived for a reason, Jana said. Maybe that reason was to be here today, to speak for my mother and sisters who cannot speak for themselves. The defense's consensual contact theory crumbled under cross-examination. No evidence supported any relationship between Hennis and Catherine. No witnesses had ever seen them together except during the dog adoption. The claim was legally necessary but factually absurd. Expert testimony about the crime scene contradicted any notion of consensual activity. The violence, the forced entry, the murder of children sleeping in their beds, everything indicated premeditated assault and execution. Military prosecutors presented their closing arguments with devastating effectiveness. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. The timeline was established. The defendant's opportunity, access, and behavior all supported guilt. Science had provided the certainty that justice demanded. Timothy Hennis murdered Catherine, Kara, and Aaron Eastburn, Captain Riesenberg concluded. DNA has given us mathematical proof of what investigators suspected 25 years ago. Justice delayed is not justice denied, it is justice finally served. The military jury deliberated for 4 hours before returning to Colonel Parrish's courtroom. The panel had reached unanimous verdicts on all charges. The courtroom filled with tension as family members, investigators, and media representatives awaited the decision that had been 25 years in the making. Has the panel reached findings? Colonel Parrish asked. We have, sir, responded the jury president, a colonel with 22 years of military service. On the charge of premeditated murder of Catherine Eastburn, how do you find? Guilty, sir. Gary Eastburn closed his eyes, feeling weight he had carried for 25 years begin to lift. Jana reached for his hand, both of them trembling with emotion. On the charge of premeditated murder of Kara Eastburn, how do you find? Guilty, sir. On the charge of premeditated murder of Aaron Eastburn, how do you find? Guilty, sir. Timothy Hennis showed no emotion as the verdicts were read. His military bearing remained intact even as his world collapsed around him. The man who had walked free from civilian court in 1989, who had lived 21 years believing himself beyond justice's reach, now faced the ultimate penalty. The sentencing phase began immediately. Military death penalty cases required separate proceedings to determine punishment. The same jury that had convicted would decide whether Hennis lived or died for his crimes. Victim impact statements brought the human cost into sharp focus. Gary Eastburn spoke about raising Jana alone, about explaining to a growing child why her mother and sisters were never coming home, about the nightmares that persisted through decades. 25 years, Gary said quietly. That's how long I've waited for this moment. Not for revenge, but for acknowledgement that what happened to my family mattered, that their lives had value, that justice exists even when it takes a quarter century to arrive. Jana testified about the psychological burden of survival, the guilt that came with being the only one spared, the questions that haunted her entire adult life. I don't remember my mother's voice, she said. I don't remember my sisters' faces except from photographs. But I remember the silence in our house when I was old enough to understand what it prize meant. That silence has lasted 25 years. The defense presented mitigation evidence: Hennis's military service record, his family relationships, his years as a law-abiding citizen after the murders. Spinner argued for life imprisonment, emphasizing that his client had lived productively for decades without committing additional crimes. But the jury's decision was swift and unanimous. Death. Timothy Hennis would be executed for the murders of Catherine, Kara, and Aaron Eastburn. Colonel Parrish imposed the sentence with military formality. The accused will be confined pending execution of this sentence. May God have mercy on your soul. As court officers led Hennis away in shackles, Gary Eastburn felt something he had not experienced in 25 years. Peace. Not happiness. Nothing could restore what had been lost, but the quiet satisfaction of justice finally served. Outside Fort Bragg's courthouse, media representatives surrounded Gary and Jana Eastburn. The story had captivated the nation. DNA evidence solving a decades-old case. Military justice succeeding where civilian courts had failed. A family finally receiving closure after a quarter century of waiting. How does it feel to finally have justice? A reporter asked. Gary considered the question carefully. Justice delayed is not justice denied, he said. My wife and daughters are still gone. That will never change. But knowing that their killer will finally answer for his crimes, that gives meaning to all the years of waiting. Jana spoke about moving forward after spending her entire adult life defined by tragedy. I can finally stop being the survivor and start being myself, she said. The questions are answered. The waiting is over. Legal experts debated the precedent set by the court-martial. The case established military jurisdiction over crimes involving service members' families, even when committed off-base and previously adjudicated in civilian courts. Constitutional scholars argued both sides. Some praised the expansion of military justice authority, others worried about potential abuses. This case proves that DNA evidence can overcome any legal obstacle, said Professor Maria Santos of Duke University Law School. But it also raises troubling questions about double jeopardy and the limits of military authority over civilian crimes. The DNA evidence that convicted Hennis represented a revolution in forensic science. Cases considered permanently cold were being reopened nationwide as laboratories applied advanced genetic analysis to preserved evidence. The Eastburn murders became a model for cold case investigation. Dr. Dixie Peters received recognition for her meticulous analysis and preservation of evidence spanning 25 years. Science doesn't forget, She told a conference of forensic investigators, "Evidence waits patiently for technology to catch up to truth." Detective Mike Locklear, who had overseen the DNA comparison that broke the case, reflected on the persistence required for cold case investigation. "We never stopped believing that someday science would give us the answers we needed. Evidence preserved properly can solve crimes decades after they occur." Fayetteville's reaction was complex relief mixed with renewed trauma as the community relived events from 1985. The military town had never fully recovered from the betrayal of trust represented by the original murders. Now, with definitive proof of Hennis's guilt, residents could finally close that psychological wound. Summerhill Road looked different in 2010 than it had in 1985. New houses filled lots that had been empty. Different families lived in homes that remembered earlier tragedies. But 367 Summerhill Road remained unchanged, occupied by people who understood the history but were not defined by it. Mrs. Morrison, now in her 80s, still lived across the street. She had watched the investigation unfold, attended both civilian trials, followed the DNA developments through news reports. "I never forgot that family," she said. "Never stopped hoping someone would pay for what happened to them." The Eastburn case influenced military justice reform, DNA evidence standards, and cold case investigation procedure. Law enforcement agencies nationwide adopted protocols for evidence preservation and advanced analysis. The 25-year journey from crime to conviction became a textbook example of persistence, science, and justice. Timothy Hennis was transported to the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, to await execution. Military death row housed fewer than 10 prisoners, making it one of the most secure facilities in the federal system. His appeals would continue through military and federal courts, a process that typically lasted years or decades. The irony was not lost on observers. The man who had worn the uniform with honor for most of his career would die wearing prison clothes, condemned by the same military justice system he had once served. His conviction ended one of the longest-running legal sagas in modern American criminal history. Gary Eastburn returned to his life with Jana, finally free to move forward without the weight of unresolved justice. The media attention gradually faded, leaving them to process 25 years of grief, anger, and hope privately. They established a scholarship fund in memory of Catherine, Kara, and Aaron, ensuring that their lives would be remembered for love rather than violence. "My family's legacy isn't how they died," Gary said in his final public statement about the case. "It's how they lived with kindness, trust, and love for others. That's what I want people to remember." Jana graduated from law school and began working with victims' rights organizations, using her unique perspective to help other families navigate the criminal justice system. Her survival had indeed served a purpose not just as a witness to her family's murder, but as an advocate for those still seeking justice. The dog that had inadvertently created the connection between Hennis and the Eastburn family lived a long, peaceful life in Oklahoma. Dixie never knew the role she had played in one of the most significant criminal cases of the late 20th century. Her innocent presence had provided the opportunity for evil, but also the evidence trail that eventually led to justice. Forensic science continued evolving, building on the foundation established by cases like Eastburn. DNA databases expanded, analysis techniques improved, and cold cases that had seemed permanently unsolvable began yielding to technological advancement. The principle demonstrated in Fayetteville that truth could outlast time inspired investigators nationwide. The classified advertisement that Catherine had placed in the Fayetteville Observer on May 6, 1985, became evidence in a murder trial 25 years later. Simple acts of kindness and trust, the foundation of military community life, had created the circumstances for tragedy, but they had also created the evidence trail that led to justice. Military families in Fayetteville slowly rebuilt the trust that had been shattered in 1985. The uniform retained its meaning, its honor, its promise of protection. One man's evil could not destroy the institution he had betrayed. If anything, the military's eventual pursuit of justice strengthened the bond between service members and the families they protected. The case closed officially on April 13, 2010, when all appeals deadlines expired and Hennis's conviction became final. 25 years, 5 months, and 4 days after Catherine, Kara, and Aaron Eastburn were murdered, their killer had been definitively identified, convicted, and condemned. Science had spoken, justice had been served, truth had endured. On Summerhill Road, spring arrived as it had for 25 consecutive years since the murders. Trees bloomed, children played, families gathered for dinner. Life continued its eternal cycle, unmarked by the darkness that had once visited this quiet street. The peace that had been shattered in 1985 was not the same peace that existed in 2010. It was deeper, harder earned, tempered by knowledge that evil existed but could not ultimately prevail. In the years following Hennis's conviction, the Eastburn case became required study in law schools, police academies, and forensic science programs across the country. The 25-year journey from crime to justice illustrated the evolution of criminal investigation, the power of DNA evidence, and the importance of evidence preservation. Professor James Mitchell of the FBI Academy at Quantico used the case to teach cold case investigation techniques. The Eastburn murders demonstrate why we never close homicide files, he told his students. Science advances, witnesses remember details, new evidence emerges. Patience and persistence can solve crimes that seem impossible. The North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation established the Eastburn Evidence Preservation Protocol, requiring specific storage conditions and chain of custody procedures for biological evidence in unsolved cases. Dr. Dixie Peters served as primary consultant, ensuring that her successful methods would be replicated statewide. Military justice reforms emerged from the constitutional questions raised by Hennis's recall to active duty. Congress clarified the authority of military courts over retired personnel, establishing procedures to prevent abuse while preserving jurisdiction over serious crimes. The Eastburn precedent influenced how military and civilian justice systems coordinated in complex cases. Gary Eastburn remarried in 2012, finding love and peace with a woman who understood his journey and accepted the memories he carried. Jana attended the wedding, celebrating her father's ability to rebuild after devastating loss. The family's story had become one of resilience as much as tragedy. Timothy Hennis remained on death row, filing appeals that grew increasingly desperate as legal options dwindled. The DNA evidence that had convicted him was unassailable. No court would overturn scientific certainty based on procedural arguments. His execution date was set pending final federal review. The case influenced legislation in 37 states, expanding statutes of limitations for DNA-supported prosecutions and improving funding for cold case investigation units. Victims' families gained new hope that decades-old crimes might still find resolution through advancing science. Fayetteville erected a small memorial to the Eastburn family in Lafayette Memorial Park, near where they were buried. The inscription read simply, "Catherine, Kara, and Aaron Eastburn, beloved family, remembered always." Visitors left flowers, particularly on the place anniversary of the murders, ensuring their memory remained alive. The classified section of the Fayetteville Observer no longer carried handwritten advertisements for pet adoptions. The internet had changed how people connected, for better and worse. The innocent trust that had characterized military communities in 1985 evolved into careful verification and background checks. Security had increased, but at the cost of spontaneous kindness. Dr. Dixie Peters retired in 2015, having overseen hundreds of DNA analyses that solved cold cases throughout North Carolina. Her final case was the Eastburn investigation. She had seen it through, from initial evidence collection to final conviction, a 25-year commitment to scientific integrity. "Evidence doesn't lie," she said in her retirement speech. "It waits patiently for us to develop the tools and wisdom to understand what it's trying to tell us." The Eastburn family deserved justice. Science finally provided the means to deliver it. As the 2010s progressed, the Eastburn case began its transition from active news story to historical example of justice, persevering through technological advancement. Law libraries housed hundreds of articles analyzing its legal precedents. Forensic textbooks featured it as a model cold case investigation. Television documentaries preserved its details for future generations. Jana Eastburn married in 2016, taking her husband's name but keeping her maiden name professionally in her victims' rights work. She spoke at conferences about surviving family murder, about growing up with unanswered questions, about the relief that came with final resolution. 25 years is a long time to wait for justice, she told audiences. But some truths are worth waiting for. My family's story proves that evil cannot hide forever from science, persistence, and the dedication of people who refuse to give up. The DNA database match that had identified Hennis inspired similar investigations nationwide. Cold case units received increased funding as politicians recognized the public relations value of solving decades-old crimes. The technology that had seemed science fiction in 1985 became routine police procedure by 2015. Summer Hill Road remained a quiet military neighborhood, though new families occupied most of the houses from 1985. Children played in yards where their parents had heard whispers of old tragedies. Life moved forward, carrying history but not defined by it. 367 Summer Hill Road, sold in 2017 to a young military family, unaware of its history. The real estate agent was not required to disclose the murders. Time had passed beyond legal notification periods. The new owners discovered the story through Google searches after moving in, but chose to stay. They understood that tragedy did not make a house evil. People did that. Mrs. Morrison passed away in 2018 at age 87, having lived across the street from the Eastburn home for over 30 years. Her obituary mentioned her role as a witness in one of the area's most significant criminal cases. She had been the last living person to see the family alive and whole. Gary Eastburn's second marriage brought him the peace he had been unable to find alone. His wife understood that he would always carry Catherine, Kara, and Aaron in his heart, not as ghosts that haunted him, but as memories that completed him. Jana gained a stepmother who respected the family that had come before. The scholarship fund established in the Eastburn family's memory grew to significant size, helping dozens of students pursue education in fields ranging from forensic science to victims advocacy. Their legacy expanded beyond tragedy to encompass opportunity for others. Timothy Hennis exhausted his final appeals in 2019. The Supreme Court declined to review his case, ending all legal challenges to his conviction. Military officials began preparations for the first military execution in decades, though the process would likely extend into the 2020s. Detective Mike Locklear retired after 30 years in law enforcement, his career highlighted by solving the case that had defined Fayetteville's collective memory. He kept a photograph of the Eastburn family on his office wall throughout his tenure, a reminder that victims deserve justice, regardless of how long it took to achieve. The Eastburn case taught me that we're not just investigating crimes, Locklear reflected. We're seeking truth for people who can't speak for themselves. Science gave us the tools to hear voices that had been silenced for 25 years. The case file, originally measured in boxes, had grown to fill an entire cabinet with appeals, motions, expert reports, and correspondence. Future researchers would find a complete record of how American justice evolved from circumstantial evidence to one scientific certainty between 1985 and 2010. As 2020 approached, marking 35 years since the murders, the Eastburn case stood as a testament to the evolution of criminal justice in America. The investigation had spanned 5 decades of law enforcement, witnessed the birth of DNA analysis, and demonstrated the power of persistence in the face of seemingly impossible obstacles. Gary Eastburn, now in his 60s, had found peace that seemed impossible in 1985. The man who had received the devastating phone call about his family's murder had lived to see their killer convicted and condemned. Not justice delayed, but justice that had waited for science to provide the certainty that truth demanded. Jana, approaching 40, had built a career helping other families navigate the criminal justice system. Her unique perspective, surviving family murder, living with unanswered questions, experiencing final resolution, gave her credibility that no academic training could provide. She had transformed personal tragedy into professional purpose. The DNA evidence that convicted Hennis remained in secure storage, a genetic fingerprint that would endure long after all human participants in the case had died. Science had achieved a form of immortality for the truth, preserving it in molecules that could be analyzed decades or centuries in the future. Fayetteville had grown and changed, but the military community's character remained constant. Soldiers still trusted their neighbors, families still helped each other through deployments and difficulties, children still played safely in residential streets. One man's evil had tested but not destroyed the bonds that made such communities possible. The classified advertisement that had started everything, Catherine's innocent offer to give Dixie a good home, served as a reminder of how random acts could intersect with evil intentions. But it also demonstrated that even in tragedy, kindness left traces that could lead to justice. The dog adoption that created opportunity for murder also created the evidence trail that led to conviction. Military justice had proven its worth in securing conviction where civilian courts had failed. The institutional memory, resources, and authority of the armed forces, had overcome legal obstacles that seemed insurmountable. Justice delayed had not been justice denied, it had been justice perfected through patience, science, and institutional determination. The Eastburn family's story would outlive all who had known them personally. Court records, news reports, legal precedents, and academic studies would preserve their memory for future generations. They had become more than victims of a horrible crime, they had become symbols of the proposition that truth ultimately prevails over evil. On Summerhill Road, spring arrived as it had for 35 years since that terrible night in May 1985. But the flowers that bloomed and the children who played did so in a world where DNA could speak for the dead, where evidence could outlast human memory, where science could achieve justice that had seemed impossible. The case was closed, the truth was known, justice had been served, and somewhere in the quiet of a North Carolina morning, 3 voices that had been silenced for 25 years could finally rest in peace, knowing that their story would never be forgotten and their killer would never escape the consequences of his evil. Catherine, Kara, and Aaron Eastburn had not died in vain. They had died for one man's inexcusable violence, but their deaths had led to advances in forensic science, improvements in victim advocacy, and proof that the arc of justice, however long, ultimately bends toward truth. The silence that had lasted 25 years was finally broken, not by voices returning from the dead, but by science speaking on their behalf, demanding justice that could not be denied, delayed, or destroyed by time.